Today we're at Mount Mansfield State Park and heading up to the rooftop of the Green Mountain State. Hi, I'm Scott Marthaler. Welcome to Rooftops of America. Today we're in Mount Mansfield State Forest and headed up to the highest peak in Vermont. But before we start this adventure, take a moment and click that red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to it for all the latest Rooftops of America updates. Located in Chittendon County, Mount Mansfield is part of the Green Mountains that rise out of the Berkshires in Massachusetts and run northwards 250 miles until they cross the border into Quebec, where they undergo a name change to Mont Souton. This is the dominant range in Vermont and part of the larger Appalachian mountain chain. Mount Mansfield itself is about 20 miles northeast of Burlington, Vermont. It runs approximately 6 miles in length from southwest to northeast. In addition to being the state high point, it is also the most prominent peak in the state at 3,633 feet. The Green Mountains are the most famous range in Vermont. They actually gave the state its name, but more on that in a little bit. They're not the only ones though. There's also the Conics and the Worcester and a few others. These ranges all came about through 3 distinct orogenies or mountain building events. The bedrock underlying them is ancient, and it came about during the first of them, the Grenville, dating back to the supercontinent of Rodinia. After the breakup of Rodinia, the Iapetus Ocean formed as the continents pulled apart, but eventually things would shift direction and slowly start to converge, closing off this tropical sea. The Green Mountains we see today came about during this sequence of events known as the Tectonic Orogeny and occurred about 450 million years ago. The final touches were brought on by the Akkadian Orogeny about 350 million years ago. All this activity had a significant effect on the types of rocks that make up the Green Mountains. Most of it's metamorphic, and it's originally from the sedimentary rock that was here and then altered by the intense heat and pressure of the faulting and folding that happened when the continents collided. The second major factor that contributed to the appearance of these mountains is erosion, particularly in the form of glaciation. Over the last 2 million years, this landscape was covered and ground down as massive ice sheets advanced and retreated several times, the final glaciers retreating about 12,000 years ago, leaving the mountains we see today. Humans first arrived in Vermont as the last ice age receded, following the caribou they hunted for survival northwards. As the glaciers dwindled and the climate warmed, the Paleo-Indians that migrated here gave way to what's known as the Archaic culture. It took several thousand years for the tundra landscape to reforest, but by around 7000 BC, the Vermont woods was quite thick. This environment saw the rise of the Archaic culture centered around valleys and rivers. The population of Vermont at the time may have been sparse, but not as light as earlier anthropological studies have suggested. Around 1000 BC, the Archaic culture would give way to the woodland culture. This is a more settled and community-based tribal structure. It was the woodland culture that the Abenaki were part of, and they would be the dominant tribe in this area when first contact with Europeans was made. The Abenaki people, meaning people of the Dawnland, were part of the Wabanaki Confederacy. several Algonquin-speaking tribes with shared cultural identities, whose territory, what they called Indokina, or our land, stretched east and north across New England into Quebec. The Abenaki were quite familiar with Mount Mansfield. The peak reminded them of the head of a moose, so they called it Mozo de Biwadso, meaning Moosehead Mountain.
The Abenaki lived in semi-permanent communities in the valleys and along the rivers. It's estimated that there were about 10,000 Abenaki tribesmen in Vermont before first contact, though the number may have been more. European influence was actually felt before the Abenaki met Europeans in the form of contagious disease that they had no immunity against. Smallpox in particular decimated Native American tribes throughout the Americas.
In 1609, Samuel de Champlain would be the first European explorer to set foot in Vermont while exploring the lake that now bears his name. French interest in Vermont was centered around Lake Champlain, with the French building several forts along its length, to include Fort St. Anne at Isle La Motte, the first European settlement in Vermont.
The Abenaki soon found themselves trapped in the proverbial rock and a hard place as they got caught up in the colonial interests of Britain and France. Of the two, the Abenaki chose to ally with the French, thinking that they treated their native allies better. The British, meanwhile, had done a great job of alienating their native neighbors. They continued to build settlements along the Connecticut River and started to cozy up with the powerful Iroquois Confederacy, the Abenaki's long-time traditional enemy.
The tension between parties would soon break out into open conflict. The Abenaki would fight against the British in multiple conflicts in both the 17th and 18th centuries, to include the devastating King Philip's War. By the French and Indian War's conclusion in 1763, the Abenaki had effectively been forced northwards into Ontario.
In 1724, at the conclusion of Dummer's War, one of those conflicts between the British and the larger Wabanaki Confederacy, Massachusetts colonists decided to build a fortification on the western banks of the Connecticut River. They named it Fort Dummer. It's located near modern-day Brattleboro, and it would go on to become the first permanent settlement in the territory that would later be Vermont. This small fort would have major ramifications for Vermont's future just a few decades later.
The creation of Vermont as a political entity is a fascinating story. When you look at this state on a map, you may ask yourself, why isn't it part of New Hampshire or perhaps even New York? Truth be told, during the colonial period, the land here had been claimed by both of those colonies at one time or another. In the 17th century, there were multiple European claimants to this territory. While the French claimed part of Vermont around Lake Champlain, further south it was claimed by the Dutch as part of the New Netherlands colony. This Dutch claim is an important point. It's the plank New York would later structure its claims on. It was also claimed by the English through the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was the basis for New Hampshire's claims.
The state's early colonial history is tied pretty tightly with its eastern neighbor, New Hampshire, and one man in particular, Benning Wentworth. Now, we're going to talk more about Wentworth when we look at Mount Washington, New Hampshire's state high point. But in the case of Vermont, all you really need to know is that Benning Wentworth was the first royal governor of the New Hampshire Crown Colony.
Politically connected and shrewd, Benning Wentworth was a bit of a rogue. Well, a bit of graft, basically using your political position for private interests, was commonplace in the American colonies in the 18th century, Wentworth would take it to new heights.
Wentworth's goals as royal governor were pretty straightforward. He wanted to gain wealth and power for New Hampshire. Also, he wanted to gain wealth and power for New Hampshire in ways that gained him personal wealth and power. One of the areas Wentworth was given oversight of was the aforementioned Fort Dummer, and it would be the key to unlock the riches that Wentworth sought.
One of the easiest ways to earn some coin while in office was through land grants. In Wentworth's mind, he knew just the place to do it. Technically, the land west of the Connecticut River and north of the Massachusetts border was under the jurisdiction of the neighboring New York colony, but there was an ongoing question of who controlled what exactly. Using his Fort Dummer toehold, Wentworth took a very broad interpretation of both his authority and what New Hampshire had oversight of. In 1749, he issued his first land grant, this one in southern Vermont, where the town of Bennington now is, the town being named in Wentworth's honor. Several years later, in 1752, this case of ownership went before the English court, where William Murray, the Earl of Mansfield and the Chief Justice of England, ruled that the land between the Connecticut River and Lake Champlain should be considered part of the colony of New Hampshire and not of New York. This decision later set the stage for Vermont's eventual statehood.
How this all worked was pretty straightforward. Wentworth would issue the grants and collect the fees. Allotments of 36 square miles at the cost of a penny an acre, a tidy little sum in the 1700s. These were purchased by land speculators, the second group. Now, they wouldn't necessarily settle the land, but they would go out and survey it and then parcel it out further to the final group, the actual individuals who would buy it and then do the back-breaking labor of taming this frontier.
In the beginning, things were kept relatively small scale and in the south, the Abenaki and their French allies preventing any major moves in the north. But all that changed after the conclusion of the French and Indian War in 1763. With both those powers now effectively out of the picture, grants were issued further north and west. For Wentworth, it was a lucrative business. From 1749 to 1764, he'd grant 129 claims, totaling quite a nice sum of money for him and his family.
For settlers willing to go into the grants, as it called, this would have been a daunting prospect. This wilderness was not a place for the faint of heart. You had the very real concerns of starvation, wild animals, a short growing season, and absolutely brutal winters. And surprisingly, at the time, those may have been the least of your concerns.
There was also the remnants of the native Abenaki people, French trappers and British soldiers, none of whom liked each other, but even that wasn't as threatening to your livelihood as the violence erupting amongst fellow colonists, particularly those from New Hampshire and those from New York.
The powers that be in New York, though, they took a rather dim view of Wentworth's scheme. The colony of New York was rich and politically well connected at the royal court. They were not about to suffer a land grab by their upstart eastern neighbor. They lobbied King George III to negate Wentworth's grants, and in 1764, George did exactly that.
George's ruling didn't settle the matter. If anything, it just ratcheted the tension up higher. The New Yorkers could label the Hampshire grants Wentworthless, but it didn't change the fact settlers were already there and more than willing to fight to keep what they felt was theirs. For most Americans, the Green Mountain Boys bring to mind Ethan Allen and their exploits in the American Revolution, particularly their surprise attack and victory at Fort Ticonderoga in New York. While these deeds have earned them a place in the annals of American history, it's only a small part of the story.
The original purpose of the Green Mountain Boys had a much darker bent to it. They were formed in 1770 as vigilantes to defend settlers of New Hampshire grants from New Yorkers who were seeking to reclaim the territory that had been ruled theirs.
By 1775, full-scale violence was close to erupting, but it was derailed by a much bigger event, the American Revolution. Interestingly enough, despite the Green Mountain Boys' contributions in the early days of the Revolution, when Vermont petitioned to be part of the Continental Congress, they were rebuffed due to the powerful New York delegation. In Congress's eyes, they needed New York more than they needed Vermont.
With all that in mind, it really shouldn't come as any surprise that Vermont would decide to go it alone. And in 1777, they did exactly that, declaring their independence from Great Britain separate from the other 13 colonies. The original name for this new republic was the Republic of New Connecticut. They also tossed around the Republic of the Green Mountains. The actual name Vermont comes from a letter in 1777 from Dr. Thomas Young, writing to the Vermont Constitutional Convention, stating that the Green Mountains made up a majority of the Republic, and that the French spelling would reflect well on the explorations of Samuel de Champlain in the early 17th century.
For the next 14 years, the Vermont Republic established itself as a sovereign entity. They drafted their own Declaration of Independence and Constitution, minted their own currency, and conducted their own affairs of state.
Ironically, the man most responsible for setting off this entire chain of events, Benning Wentworth, probably would not have looked too favorably on Vermont's struggle for independence. After all, this was supposed to be New Hampshire grants. But we'll never quite know what Wentworth thought. He passed away in 1770.
It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. The Continental Congress refused to recognize the small republic, going so far as to recommend to General George Washington that he invade it. He declined. In 1785, Vermont legitimized the Hampshire grants by paying the now state of New York the sum of $30,000, about $900,000 in today's money. In turn, New York relinquished any claim on Vermont's territory.
It was always Vermont's intention to join the United States. Most Vermonters were quite in favor of the new nation. The issue had always been the land claims, and now that that point of contention had been resolved, the way was open for statehood.
On March 4th, 1791, Vermont joined the Union as the 14th state. The Vermont Republic carried on, though. Its constitution and laws remained in place and continued to be used by the state of Vermont. On a side note, the act that admitted the 14th state was the shortest of all state admissions, and to this day, Vermont is the only state admitted without conditions of any kind.
This area of Vermont took a bit more time to settle. Originally, it was one of the Hampshire grants doled out by Governor Wentworth. In 1772, the Allen brothers, Ethan, whom we've already met, and his brother Ira, made a deal to survey this land in return for a large share of it, and they hoped to then sell that for profit.
When Ira Allen and his survey team arrived, they were in for a rude awakening. The land had a rather large problem, namely a mountain running right through the middle of it. Needless to say, this was not land suited for agricultural pursuits.
On a side note, Ira Allen and his surveying team may very well have been the first white men to ever summit Mount Mansfield. Despite the predicament that Ira Allen found himself in, he was nothing if not resourceful. So he fudged the survey findings a bit, and then took the next step of going to his fellow proprietors who hadn't seen the land and tried to convince them to sell their shares. This convinced them, though, that the land was worth more than Allen was saying. Needless to say, Ira Allen sold his shares for a profit. The truth was, most of the land was worthless if you were going to try to grow any kind of crops. Only parts on the eastern slope were able to support some form of limited agriculture. The first settler to Mansfield didn't actually arrive until 1799. One thing that was settled before this was even surveyed was the name, Mansfield. It was given when the original grant was awarded by Governor Wentworth. There's some lines of thinking that state the name is in recognition of a town from Connecticut several of the proprietors were from. There's another line of thinking that states that it's actually in recognition of William Murray, the Earl of Mansfield, who had made that absolutely critical ruling in New Hampshire's favor in 1752. In 1793, settlers established the town of Underhill on the western side of the mountain and Stowe on the eastern. Timber and farming would be the order of the day and drive the economy of the region in these early days. Most of the agricultural efforts here were little more than subsistence farming. Nearby Smuggler's Notch would gain its own notoriety. It started in the early 19th century when President Thomas Jefferson signed the Embargo Act of 1807. The intent of the law was to keep the U.S. out of the Napoleonic Wars that were currently ravaging Europe. Do so by prohibiting trade with Great Britain and, by extension, Canada. Unfortunately, it would have some major consequences for folks living in this area, who often found themselves trading goods north of the border. Illegal trade soon cropped up, with goods, livestock, and other materials heading along this route. The narrow passage and large caves made it ideal for stashing materials going north or south. Later on, the notch would be used as an escape route for fugitive slaves heading to Canada and freedom. Even after the road here was improved for automobiles in the early 20th century, this was still a favorite for smugglers. During Prohibition, more than a few cases of bootleg liquor made their way down through this route from Canada. As the 1800s trundled along, this area evolved, but not the town of Mansfield. Never much in the way of population to begin with, it was finally dissolved by the Vermont legislature in 1848, with parts of it going to Underhill and others to Stowe. The mountain, though, would keep the Mansfield name alive. The forest would disappear as well. By the end of the 1800s, this area was effectively deforested. Hard to tell these days, but most of this area was opened up for farming. 75% of the land was dedicated to agriculture, originally wool, but later changing to dairy as commodity markets fluctuated. The loss of the woods would be a precursor to the later loss of farms. The soil on the mountain slopes, while never nutrient-rich, would soon be depleted. Farms slowly started to disappear, and over time the forests reclaimed this land. If you have time, you can still get a glimpse of this life at Little River State Park. There is a history trail there that takes you through some of the ruins of the homesteads that once covered the area. The forests and the farms weren't the only things changing around the mountain, though. In nearby Stowe, things were taking a slightly different turn as well. Stowe, unlike a lot of towns in Vermont, wasn't wholly shackled to dairy and timber as its economic drivers. It had an ace in the hole, so to speak. in the form of its giant next-door neighbor, Mount Mansfield.
By the middle of the 19th century, this area was starting to establish a reputation as a premier resort. The scenic views and cool mountain air made it a nice escape. Once the railroad arrived, Mount Mansfield became even more of a draw. The current-day toll road got its start as a carriage road in 1870, and on top of the mountain, overlooking it all, was the Mount Mansfield Summit House.
The summer season wasn't the only thing in this mountain's favor, though. It would soon realize its true potential in the colder months. When you look at Mount Mansfield today, it really shouldn't come as any surprise that this peak would play a key role both in the development and popularity of a sport that's now considered a winter standard: downhill skiing.
Skiing is thousands of years old, but as a winter sport, it's relatively new to the scene, first getting started in the mid-19th century in Scandinavia. In the US, at the start of the 20th century, it was a niche activity, at best mainly practiced in northern communities with Scandinavian populations.
On February 1st, 1914, Nathaniel Goodrich, a librarian from Dartmouth University, would make a little bit of history here. He hiked up the toll road and then skied all the way back down. It was the first official skiing descent on Mount Mansfield. That said, it'd take another 20 years for the sport really to take off here. During the Great Depression, the Civilian Conservation Corps was put to work clearing out ski trails. The first one was started in 1933, known as the Bruce. After it was finished, they started and cleared out the Nosedive Trail with its famous 7 turns.
It's hard to overstate the importance of Mount Mansfield in the early history of downhill skiing here in the U.S. As the sport grew in popularity, so did development at Mount Mansfield. The Stowe Ski Resort has been here for over 80 years. It is home to the oldest ski patrol in the U.S., and at one point, you would have found the world's longest and tallest ski lift here.
These days, Mount Mansfield is one of the premier hiking and skiing destinations in New England. Most of the mountain is protected by the Mount Mansfield State Forest. At 44,444 acres, it's the largest state forest in Vermont.
Within the bounds of the state forest are several state parks and several major ski resorts, and a few national natural landmarks. Interestingly enough, the state forest doesn't include all of the mountain. The summit ridge, about 400 acres, is actually owned by the University of Vermont. The high points on the Mansfield summit ridge are labeled in terms of a face. When you take in this mountain from the west or east, it is said to resemble the profile of a human, and the corresponding peaks on the ridgeline reflect the forehead, nose, and chin.
The legend goes that one day, a giant from the south was out for a walk heading north. He grew tired from his journey and he laid down to sleep, and he's never woken since. Now, our giant's face isn't exactly anatomically correct on most people. The nose would be the highest point on a face. Here, it's his chin, and it's about time we head on up there.
As you can expect with so many outdoor options available, the Mount Mansfield area is a popular Vermont hiking destination, especially in the warmer months. There are a myriad of trails, with more than a few leading to the summit, with differing lengths and technical skill, including the Sunset Trail, the Profanity Trail, and the famous Long Trail. In addition to hiking up, Mount Mansfield also provides one of the more interesting ways to get to the top of a state high point, by way of gondola. It's the only state high point with this option, so it's worth considering if you want to try something different on your high-pointing adventure. If you opt to take the gondola, it's actually a lot of fun, and you're going to get some fun views as you go up and eventually come down. But if you decide to take it up and then continue on to the chin, well, it's sort of a tale of two cities, because this part is actually really easy and low key. You're going to gain a lot of elevation fast. It's just the latter half that becomes interesting. If you do decide to take the cliff trail up to the chin, then approach with caution. It is one of the most technically challenging trails on the mountain, and even more treacherous when it's wet like it is today, which is why we're not going up it. But while it doesn't seem like a lot, only a couple hundred meters, it is mighty and challenging. Finally, you have the option to drive up most of the way. In the summer, you can take the auto road up, though there is a toll, so check for pricing before you go. Once you actually park, come up a small rise, you'll find a building called the Visitor Center. Right beyond that, you will actually find the trail that will take you up to the chin, the summit of Mount Mansfield. From this point, it's about 1.4 miles. Today, I've got a good hat on, a good pair of boots, and plenty of water and gear to make it up there. Let's go check it out. I've actually made an attempt at Mount Mansfield before, in February 2017. Needless to say, it did not go as planned, and we ended up turning around, knowing that, it just wasn't a safe ascent, and knowing that we'd have to cross over some of this stuff on the descent as well. So, in the interest of safety, we made that decision that the mountain will always be there. Better safe than sorry. As you hike along the ridge, you'll notice an interesting environment. This mountain, along with Camel's Hump and Mount Abraham, are the only places in the state of Vermont where you will find true Arctic tundra. That environment has existed here since the last ice age. Of those three peaks, Mount Mansfield has the largest portion, almost 200 acres. The ecosystem is fragile, and with Mount Mansfield being the most visited mountain in Vermont, with up to 40,000 visitors a year, it is imperative to tread lightly. So when you're up here, stay on the trail. This trail, it's easy to see why it is often considered one of the easiest routes to the summit. It's very straightforward. Not a lot of up and down. The trail is well marked, the white hashes, and in the case of mine, strings, literally going most of the way, especially over the rocks, to let people know, not only where the trail is, but where not to step to protect that alpine tundra. So keep that in consideration if you decide to take this route.
So on this hike, I brought my trekking poles with me, not knowing if I would need them or not. Going up, I used them a little bit, but I can tell that these are going to be worth their weight in gold on the way down. I think they're going to come in quite handy. And if you decide to do this peak in more, say, inclement weather, with how slick this rock will get, then trekking poles could be a useful thing. One of the great things about the Nose to Chin Trail is that you can see your destination for almost all of it until you get right about here, not too far beyond where the Sunset Trail or Sunset Ridge Trail, the Profanity Trail, meets up with the Long Trail. At this point, it sort of ducks in and the chin disappears. But believe it or not, you're only about 200 meters away from the summit. Once on the summit, you'll be able to take in one of the best views in Vermont on clear days, spying Lake Champlain, Quebec, Canada, in the full glory of the Green Mountains. And here we are on the summit of Mount Mansfield, the rooftop of Vermont. With an elevation of 4,393 feet, this is the 26th highest state high point in the USA. I'm Scott Marthaler. Thanks for joining me on Rooftops of America. Before you go, leave a comment, click those like and subscribe buttons below, and I'll see you soon.